Yes, it's time for The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. And with us this week from the Daily and Sunday Telegraph, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, welcome. Hello. Nice to see you. Nice to see you as well. Vivian Walt of Time Magazine, Régis Le Sommier of Paris Match, holding up after being proud father this week.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank
10
you
days
very
ago,
much.
sorry.
10 days, yes.
For first day back with us at least. Also with us, Stéphane de Vries of the Dutch station RTL4. Thank you for being with us, The World This Week, where throughout the week you can weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and also on Twitter. You can find us at FrançoisF24. Before we broach the topic of Syria and Russia, this question: could a forgotten report sitting in a UN office in New York shed new light on the outbreak of Rwanda's genocide? British historian and journalist Linda Melvern, writing in French daily newspaper Libération, finds an inventory of the Hutu-led army's capacities from 1994 that includes an undetermined number of Soviet-made SA-7 ground air missiles and more of French make. Now, that meshes with the long-held suspicion that it was indeed a Soviet missile that shot down the Soviet-made missile, rather, that shot down the plane carrying Rwanda and Burundi's presidents April the 6th, 1994, the event that triggered the genocide in Rwanda. Up to now, though, ex-Hutu leaders had always denied their army even had ground air missiles, a claim always repeated here in Paris by French leaders who, it turns out, weren't even allowed to export those Mistral missiles. And yet, this document, Régis Le Sommier, shows that the French had exported missiles.
Yeah, it's another twist and turn in the Rwanda case, which keeps being a very complex and very murky case. I don't know if that will solve and that will bring some explanation to the plane, the presidential plane being shot down in 1994. But it's certainly something. It's a piece of evidence that, of course, there is probably some other sides to the cards that were being played by other intermediary. We've heard again about Paul Baril and people like that. But it's another piece in a very complex case, I would say.
Vivian Walt, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think we also have to look at how, as you said, this was simply forgotten in the UN archives. It does seem to be, although Régis says it's just another little piece in the puzzle, it's a very key piece. The whole controversy for 18 years now has been what kind of missile shot down the plane and where and who possessed such a thing. And so much, blood and treasure has been spent trying to figure out the answer to that it seems very strange that this simply was never mentioned at all.
That published report, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, at no point implicates the French in any way in this. But what it does say about the French is, what it does accuse French politicians of doing is throwing up a lot of red herrings, sending journalists down the wrong path in their investigations.
If they knew about this, because it doesn't mean that all French politicians knew about this, assuming that France sold these missiles, which is very possible. There's a military-industrial complex in France.
But it has politicians, just to be clear, politicians from both sides of the island, France, denying that there even were missiles in Rwanda in the hands of the Rwandan army.
It is entirely possible that some of those were sincere on this. Possibly not all of those, but it's possible some of them actually did not know. You've got a small military-industrial complex in France, which is populated by the same people, right and left, basically, and which is tied to the fact that our armaments industry is state-run, and not everybody knows about this. But it's interesting. interesting that the document is coming from the UN. Many things are murky about the Rwanda thing in the UN. To begin with the famous, genocide facts sent by Major Roméo Dallaire, the Colonel Roméo Dallaire, who was the head of the UN forces and who announced the genocide several weeks in advance, saying there is a plan, they are arming themselves, they're organizing this, and he sent this to his chief. His chief of the time was the head of the armed forces of the UN, and that was Kofi Annan.
Of peacekeeping.
Of the peacekeeping forces, and Kofi Annan did literally absolutely nothing. And eventually the UN forces were withdrawn almost immediately after there was an incident. The incident had happened precisely because they wanted to call this withdrawal. But how can you keep the peace if the minute you're being shot at? And I said an army because actually they are armed. You're armed, but all the same you're being shot at, and immediately you're withdrawn, and then people can get away with literally murder of possibly 1 million people.
Well, there were those 10 Belgian peacekeepers that were horrifically murdered at the time.
Yes, that was it. But then you murder 800,000 to 1 million people.
What's interesting, is that the investigation by the Juge Bruguière found, exactly the contrary. I mean, saying
the opposite
that
conclusion from the current investigating team,
which tells a lot about all the twists
Bruguière,
and turns.
who never
again.
went to Rwanda himself.
That's true. Sorry.
Final point on this, Stéphane de Vries. This is a case which obviously not only divides the Rwandans and has made the diplomatic relations between France and Rwanda frayed. It also divides journalists. There are journalists in Paris who don't speak to each other anymore 18 years after the fact over this very issue.
I wasn't aware of that, but it basically shows how messed up French politics in Africa is, because even if this document doesn't directly imply the French government, it really shows something. And like Régis said, the judge that was in charge of this investigation, the Bruguière, he was a very famous terrorist judge in Paris. He wrote a very different report in 2006. I think, and he was corrected by another judge in this year, in the beginning of this year, who had a complete opposite conclusion. So it seems like a cover-up. Of course, it sounds a little bit like a conspiracy theory, and it's very hard to judge as a bystander, of course. But this document is very worrying, and it shows that there's far more than the French government is willing to admit.
All right, we'll pick up, obviously, on this as more develops. The story that's dominated the headlines around the world this week has been Syria, of course, and their protesters this Friday coming out once again. This Friday marking 1 week since a horrific massacre in the central town of Hula. 108 killed, 3/4 of them women and children. The outrage unabated. The Syrian government blames armed opposition, but the UN human rights body says initial evidence suggests heavy weapons shelling and a trail which could lead as well to the Shabiha pro-government militia. Vivian Walt, earlier this week, the special envoy, Kofi Annan, said this could be a turning point. Is that going to pan out that way?
I'm sure it's a turning point, absolutely. But it's funny that we're mentioning Kofi Annan again, because really, let's once and for all declare the Annan plan dead, if it ever got off the ground. But the very fact that he's still doing shuttle diplomacy seems a little ridiculous. And in fact, he went into this essentially because partly...
So there should be no dialogue with the Syrians at all?
Well, certainly there should be, but under the kind of framework of the Annan plan, it just seems to be so unworkable. And what it's done is effectively hobbled the opposition in a way that the regime is not hobbled. So, and it seems to me also that Annan went into this a little bit, one piece of it, because I think he was so anguished by what had happened in Rwanda under his watch. And there always has been a kind of issue with Kofi Annan about how much he didn't do, just as we were discussing a few minutes ago. So it seems to me like...
Well,
Sorry.
But somebody has to do something. I mean, Kofi Annan was the one willing to step in and try to actually... try to work some sort of plan for Syria. I mean, you said it didn't really went off the ground. It's true, but he actually tried to do something.
Absolutely, and
I
he should be
hear,
applauded by that. But he also kind of too readily accepted that the Syrian government had signed off on it.
Well, yeah, everybody is trying to work his case and is doing tricky moves on whether it is the Syrian opposition or the government, and we all know we're not naive, and we know that there are many issues at stake on the Syrian civil war, because we can call it a civil war at this point. But I wouldn't blame Anand for trying to do something. I mean, because we're hearing Obama, we're hearing Hollande now saying Bashar has to leave power. We've heard that for months. Now, no one has come with a plan saying Bashar should leave, and we have a plan. That's what should be. What is going to follow? What is going to be the kind? Is it going to be the kind of political structure as we kept in Egypt when Mubarak left? But there was no civil war in Egypt, so it's not the same thing. We have an alliance of clans, which are called the Alawites, that are in power, that want to remain in power, and we have a strong Sunni insurrection that wants this power. And I think none of these guys, the Sunni gets the power, they're going to get rid of the Alawites, and the Alawites are. So it is a civil war, and so we hear Bashar has to leave power, the Bashar clan has to leave power. What is to come next? That's my question.
At the beginning of the week began with everybody pointing to what diplomats had told the New York Times about installing some kind of what they called a Yemen solution. In fact, diplomats now even calling it by its Russian name, the Yemensky variant. At the end of the week, we're no longer talking about that anymore, taking Assad out and keeping the regime much in the same way that it happened in Yemen.
Yeah, well, this shows that we really have no clue what to do with Syria. I mean, Kofi Annan, I don't know if he has to be applauded or to be insulted, but he's there on behalf of the United Nations. And when it comes to Syria, the United Nations is basically ruled by Russia and China because they veto everything the other countries propose. So he is there on behalf of Russia and China. It's as simple as that.
As far as I know, the United Nations still have Syria on the board of the Human Rights Committee.
Mm-hmm. UNESCO, I believe.
And they also had Libya at some stage. So I have a beef with Kofi Annan. Yes, it is quite right. You should try and do something, but because the UN is about preserving the sensitivities of the many dictatorial governments that also belong to the UN, what he's gone into this. He cannot be so naive as not to think that they're lying to him.
But hang on, isn't it a safe sport to be bashing the UN? It's a talk shop in the UN, and here in this instance. It's more about the major powers convincing the Russia and China.
Well, in which case, Kofi Annan's mission is not much use. I do not know, well worth trying. But the idea that because he's there, nothing else can happen, and then the idea that you can do diplomacy in the Middle East and not take into account the fact that some people might be lying through their teeth to you and not have any kind of intention of doing what you do, it's more than naivete. It's actually enabling. And that's what Annan has been doing.
Now, going into his Friday dinner with Vladimir Putin, the French president had refused to rule out an eventual military intervention. But he says, François Hollande, only through the Security Council. For now, though, as Stéphane was saying, the buck stops with Moscow. Washington on a similar line with Paris this week, in fact, raising the rhetoric.
The Russians keep telling us they want to do everything they can to avoid a civil war because they believe that the violence would be catastrophic, and they're just vociferous in their claim that they are providing a stabilizing influence. I reject that. I think they are, in effect, propping up the regime at a time when we should be working on a political transition.
Those who accuse Russia of one-sidedly supporting a regime, in this case we are talking about the Assad regime, are wrong. As for supplying weapons, Russia does not provide weapons that could be used in a civil conflict.
it goes a step further, Vivian Walt. That's the soft version you heard in Berlin. The Russian Foreign Ministry coming out with a statement saying the tragedy in Hula shows what can be the outcome of financial aid and smuggling of modern weapons to rebels, recruitment of foreign mercenaries, and flirting with various sorts of extremists.
Well, firstly, Russia. Russia just in January signed this arms deal with Syria that I believe was worth $550 million. So it is still a major, major trading partner in the weapons industry. Secondly, yes, it seems that it is true that there are weapons now going to rebels. Qatar and Saudi Arabia have both clearly started some kind of pipeline of weapons to the rebels. And that, of course, gives Russia the perfect cover to say what the foreign minister had to say.
This Friday, French newspaper Le Monde, quoting European officials, is saying they're discreetly debating the idea of a boycott of the 2014 Winter Olympics to take place in Sochi. What kind of leverage does the West have with Russia right now?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we have much leverage. What I see going on in Syria is probably the type of scenario we've seen going on in Lebanon in the 1980s, meaning several countries with various interests stepping in a country. So it went from Beirut to now to Damascus, with similar pattern and probably a very bloody war for a long time. Now, is it only the fault of Russia? Is it the only country that smuggle weapons or that has deal with? Certainly it has, but I'm not sure that either Saudi Arabia or Qatar are innocent in that. And I'm sure Iran has a huge interest in what's going on in Syria as well. So I see a scenario as a Lebanon scenario going on with a much wider state.
Let's hope
Yes.
it doesn't play out that way. When we come back, the World This Week looks at the long drawn-out scenario for Europe's finances and some happier news, if you will, from across the channel. Stay with us.